On a deserted Florida highway, Maya Thompson, a high-ranking federal officer, drives alone, exhausted but alert. When red and blue lights flash behind her, she knows this isn't just a traffic stop. Two white officers approach, one smirking, the other hand near his gun. Their tone? Dripping with superiority. Their words? Loaded with quiet threats. But Maya isn't just another black woman to intimidate. She's someone they'll regret underestimating. On a moonless Florida night, the hum of Maya Thompson's black SUV was the only sound cutting through the vast emptiness of Highway 17. She was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that sank into her bones after a 14-hour day behind closed doors at a classified federal briefing. She wasn't just any driver on the road. Maya was the assistant director of national intelligence, a black woman who'd clawed her way to the top in a world that had never wanted her there. But none of that mattered now. Not her title, not her resume, not the lifetime of training that made her sharper than most men in Washington, because when the red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror like a warning shot through the dark, Maya knew. This wasn't about a broken law. It was about who she was and what she looked like. Her foot eased off the gas. Her fingers gripped the wheel. She didn't need to check her speed. 65. On the dot. Her SUV was registered, her license clean, her record impeccable. But that wasn't why they pulled her over. She felt it in her gut. The kind of instinct you don't learn in school. The kind that comes from surviving in a world wired against you. The patrol car behind her lingered. Too long. No loudspeaker instructions. No signs of protocol. Just silence. The dangerous kind. Then a door slammed. The officer who approached wasn't just walking. He was claiming territory. Mid-40s. White. With a belly pushing at the seams of his uniform and a flashlight swinging like a baton of authority. His right hand hovered far too close to the weapon on his hip. The other officer stood back, arms crossed, watching, a silent endorsement of whatever came next. Maya rolled down the window halfway. No sudden moves. No words yet. Let him speak first. "Lot of road out here," the officer said, smirking. "Not a lot of reason to be driving it. Where you headed, sweetheart?" The word clung to the air like smoke. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Maya's voice was calm, crisp, practiced. "Is there a reason I was pulled over, officer?" The smirk dropped. His hand twitched. "License and registration. And don't try anything cute." She moved slowly, deliberately. No panic, no hesitation. Her phone was already recording from the moment the lights appeared. She handed over her ID without a word. Not the one with her title, just her name. Maya Thompson. He snatched it like it was trash. "Thompson," he muttered, studying it like a joke he didn't find funny. Then his eyes snapped back to hers. "One of those, huh? Always got the rules memorized. Probably got a lawyer on speed dial." The other officer leaned against the cruiser, still watching, still saying nothing. The flashlight beam danced across her face, searching for weakness. There was none. "You people always gotta prove something," the officer sneered. "So tell me, Miss Thompson, what are you trying to prove out here tonight?" What she was trying to prove? That she belonged. That her skin didn't make her suspicious. That driving while black shouldn't be a death sentence. But Maya didn't say any of that. She just looked him in the eye. "Am I being detained, officer?" The smirk returned, but now it was thinner. Meaner. He stepped closer, boots crunching gravel. "Oh, we got a smart one. Thinks she knows how this works. Thing is, Miss Thompson, it doesn't work for you. Not out here. The second officer pushed off the car, hand now resting on his holster. Maya felt the shift. It wasn't just intimidation now, it was escalation. They were pushing her to react. One wrong word, one wrong breath. She kept her hands on the wheel, visible, still. I've provided everything you asked for, she said firmly. If there's no legal reason for this stop, I'll be on my way. The officer's face twisted. Step out of the vehicle. On what grounds? Suspicious behavior. Her doors were locked. She had done it when she saw his stance change. He yanked at the handle. It didn't budge. He slammed his palm against the window. Hard. You think you're better than us? He hissed. With your fancy job and your smart mouth? You people think you can bend the law, but out here, I am the law. And then, he drew his weapon. The gun came up fast, pointed straight at her head through the window. The world narrowed to the barrel of that gun, and the weight of history pressing behind it. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stared. Her phone kept recording. And then, sirens. A wail slicing through the dark, flashing lights in the distance, more squad cars barreling toward them. The officer froze, just a flicker, his hand still on the trigger. But his eyes changed. Fear. Not of Maya, but of consequence, of cameras, of exposure. The new cars skidded to a stop. Doors opened. Officers emerged. A black lieutenant stepped forward, authority in every line of his body. "Cooper," he barked. "Lower your weapon! Now!" Maya saw it. The flicker of disbelief. The war behind Cooper's eyes. His fingers trembled. And then, he lowered it. Slowly. But not because he respected her. Because he knew the story was no longer his to write. The lieutenant stepped closer. "Ma'am, are you—" "Director Maya Thompson, U.S. Intelligence." Silence. The kind that rewrites fates. Every officer froze. The second cop, Todd, turned ghost pale. The lieutenant didn't blink. "You're done, Cooper. Cuff him." The handcuffs clicked like thunder. Cooper snarled. "You think this is over?" Maya finally spoke, her voice like ice. "It's just beginning. This is what happens when silence is broken. When witnesses record. When a system built on fear is forced to answer. Subscribe now for real stories that expose the truth, challenge injustice, and amplify voices that won't be silenced. Turn on notifications. You need to see how this ends." Maya Thompson had spent 2 decades rising through the ranks of U.S. intelligence, learning to command rooms filled with men who doubted her, mastering the art of silence in spaces that tried to erase her, and surviving systems designed to grind down black women until they broke. She was no stranger to war zones. She'd negotiated hostage exchanges in Syria, tracked terror cells across Eastern Europe, and coordinated cyber ops under presidents who barely remembered her name. But nothing prepared her for the raw, unfiltered humiliation of that night on Highway 17, under a moonless sky, with 2 white officers treating her like nothing more than a threat to be subdued. Her SUV had glided through the dark like a shadow, the hum of the tires a quiet comfort after the weight of classified briefings and bureaucratic warfare. She'd thought the worst of the day was behind her. But when red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror, her stomach dropped with a sickening certainty. This wasn't about law. It was about power. And she didn't have it. Not here. Not now. She'd been tired. Physically, yes, but also spiritually. tired in the way black women often are, carrying the burdens no one else sees. Tired of being questioned, of having to prove and reprove her worth. Tired of the double glances, the condescension wrapped in compliments, the way white men in suits smiled when she spoke, but never really listened. And now, here on a deserted stretch of Florida highway, she wasn't the director of anything. She was a target. Her training kicked in. She checked her speed. 65. Perfect. No swerving. No cause. Her hands gripped the wheel as the cruiser behind her refused to pass or pull beside her. They were toying with her. And deep down she knew, they already knew who she was. That's what made this worse. This wasn't a mistake. It was personal. They wanted to see her squirm. She pulled over slowly, placed her phone on the passenger seat, tapped the record button with fingers that had once disarmed explosives, and called the number she'd memorized since the day she earned her clearance. "Director Thompson," the voice on the other end answered immediately. "Pulled over. Highway 17. 15 miles out of Jacksonville," she said calmly, masking the storm behind her ribs. "Understood. Units en route." The call ended. The recording continued. She placed both hands on the wheel. Then she waited. It started with a door slam. Then came the crunch of boots against gravel. The first officer, Bradley Cooper, was built like every stereotype of backwoods authority. Thick-necked, mid-40s, his belly hanging over his belt, and a flashlight swinging lazily like a weapon. He didn't bother with a greeting. "Lot of road out here," he said, eyes scanning her with unhidden disdain. "Not a lot of reason to be driving this late." His voice was syrupy with condescension, but his stance screamed threat. His right hand hovered near his holster. Maya knew the script, knew exactly how fast things could spiral. "Still," she asked, "is there a reason I was pulled over, officer?" And with that, the game began, the twisting of law into intimidation. "License and registration. Don't try anything cute," he snapped. No explanation. No infraction cited. Just authority flexed like a muscle. Maya moved slowly, precisely, knowing that any sudden motion might become the headline that wrote her obituary. She handed him her license, registration, and an ID that didn't scream her rank. Just her name. He studied it, smirked. "Maya Thompson," he murmured. "Sounds familiar?" She said nothing. He took a step closer, flashlight blinding her eyes. "You one of those, huh? Knows all the rules. Probably got some fancy lawyer ready to cry discrimination." The second officer, Todd Jefferson, leaned on the cruiser, arms crossed, watching like he'd seen this 100 times, and never once thought it was wrong. He was younger, leaner, but no less dangerous. His smirk said everything. They weren't interested in enforcing the law. They were trying to break her. "You people always act like you got something to prove," Bradley sneered. "So what is it, Miss Thompson? What are you trying to prove tonight?" She stared at him, controlled. "Am I being detained?" she asked. The smirk twitched into something nastier. "You don't tell me how to do my job." He leaned in close enough for her to smell his breath. "Your problem is, you people never know when to shut up." Maya's heart pounded, but not in fear. In fury, not just for herself, but for every name she carried. Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Atatiana Jefferson, women who never made it home. She didn't flinch. "If there's no reason for this stop, I'd like to go." That's when Bradley snapped. "Step out of the car." "On what grounds?" she asked. "Suspicious behavior." Todd chuckled behind him. "They always start acting real suspicious the second we stop them." Maya's door didn't open. She'd locked it the moment his stance shifted. Bradley yanked at it anyway, then slammed his hand against the roof. "You think you can question me?" he barked. "You think the law works for you? It works against you, and right now, so do I." And then, he pulled his weapon. It was smooth, practiced. The gun rose like second nature, aimed straight at her face through the glass. For a split second, time froze, and in that second, Maya thought of her mother, the way she used to press her palms together every night and whisper prayers for her daughter's safety in a world that never loved her back. She thought of her brother, who was stopped at 16 for walking while black and never smiled the same after. She thought of the awards on her office wall, the ones they said she'd earned, but that couldn't save her now. This was her America, raw and unfiltered, where a badge could be a loaded gun and black success was just a bigger target. And then, sirens. Not one, but many. The wailing chorus of backup approaching fast. Tires screeched. Doors flew open. Flashlights lit the night like battlefield flares. A black lieutenant stepped forward, voice sharp. "Cooper, lower your weapon! Now!" The power shifted. Bradley hesitated. Just long enough for Maya to see it. The fear, the calculation, the awareness that whatever fantasy of domination he'd conjured up was slipping through his fingers. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the gun, but not with respect. With rage. "Ma'am," the lieutenant asked, approaching her window. "Are you Director Maya Thompson, U.S. Intelligence?" The words cut like a knife. Every officer stiffened. Todd turned white. Bradley didn't blink, but his jaw clenched hard enough to crack bone. The lieutenant didn't hesitate. "You're done," he said. "Cuff him." Bradley's voice rose like a dying animal's. "You think this is over? You think this means anything?" Maya didn't blink. "I know exactly what this means," she said. They cuffed him. Then Todd. Both led away like children caught stealing, their swagger gone, replaced by the flat realization that power, once unchecked, now had consequences. A civilian stepped forward from the roadside, phone still recording. "They do this all the time," he said quietly. "Just not to someone like you." And those words hurt the most. Because they were true. This wasn't rare. It was routine. The only difference was that Maya had the title, the badge, the connections to fight back. And even then, they'd pointed a gun at her head. Even then, she could have become another hashtag, another face on a t-shirt, another what could have been. The weight of that truth sat heavy in her chest. And when she exhaled, it wasn't relief. It was grief. For every black woman who wouldn't get a siren in time. For everyone who screamed and wasn't heard. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered. "Director Thompson?" the voice asked. It was the witness. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate what you did. Most people wouldn't." Maya leaned back in her seat, the tremors just beginning to set in. "Most people don't have the power to," she whispered. A pause. Then, "But I do." Subscribe now for raw, powerful stories that reveal the truth behind the badge, the uniform, and the silence. Turn on notifications. This isn't entertainment. This is reality, and it needs to be seen. Let me know if you'd like to adapt this into a narrated video script or a multi-part series. The night was still, but Maya Thompson's soul was anything but. She sat in the driver's seat of her black SUV, the engine humming softly beneath her, a useless comfort against the thunder roaring in her chest. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, like a ribbon of darkness, but her world had shrunk down to the flash of red and blue lights spinning violently in her rearview mirror. Just minutes ago, She had been nothing but a weary federal official returning home after another classified briefing. One more mission, one more layer of exhaustion, one more day of being the only black woman in a room full of powerful white men who called her impressive, but never stopped second-guessing her. She'd fought her way into those spaces, earned every stripe, every clearance level, every sleepless night. But none of that mattered now, because the moment those sirens came alive behind her, the moment she saw the silhouette of a white officer approaching with smug confidence and a hand too close to his gun, she was no longer the director of anything. She was just another black woman. Alone. Vulnerable. And very possibly about to become a statistic. Her breath came shallow, tight. Not from fear, but from fury. The kind of fury you're forced to hide, to bury, because showing it could get you killed. It wasn't the first time she'd been pulled over without cause, but something about this felt darker, louder, like the air itself was holding its breath. Her training whispered through her nerves. Move slow. Speak calm. Stay alive. Her fingers, trembling beneath a mask of control, tapped the record button on her phone. Then she called a number no civilian had, a direct line to D.C. "Director Thompson," came the voice. "Highway 17, she said evenly. 15 miles out from Jacksonville. I've been pulled over." "Understood. Units en route." The call ended, but the fight had just begun. The officer stepped into her line of sight, Officer Bradley Cooper, his body language radiating superiority, entitlement, danger. He didn't ask if she was okay, didn't cite a violation, just smirked and said, "Lot of road out here, not a lot of reason to be driving this late." His tone wasn't casual, it was condescending and loaded. Maya knew exactly what he was doing. He was testing her humanity, trying to peel away her confidence, strip her dignity one word at a time. He asked for her license and registration, then yanked them from her hands like she was handing him trash. No ma'am, no decency, just, "You people always got something to prove." She wanted to scream, not for herself, but for every black woman who had driven this same road, lived this same moment, and didn't make it home. But Maya didn't scream. She survived. Because survival wasn't just instinct, it was strategy. "Am I being detained, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice flat. Calm. A lifeline in a hurricane. He didn't like that. Not one bit. "Step out of the car," he barked. She didn't move. "On what grounds?" "Suspicious behavior," he snapped. Behind him, Officer Todd Jefferson, younger, lankier, leaned against the patrol car, fingers brushing the strap of his holster, expression unreadable, but complicit. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears. This was the moment where things changed, where power became weaponized, where control vanished. She had locked the doors earlier. Bradley yanked the handle, but it didn't budge, so he slammed his palm against the roof. "You think you can talk back to me?" he growled. "You think your little degrees and titles mean something out here?" Then he stepped back and drew his gun, and pointed it at her head. That moment shattered something inside her. She wasn't just looking at a gun. She was staring down history. 1,000 stories collapsed into that single barrel. Tamir, Sandra, Philando, Atatiana. The names pounded through her skull like a heartbeat. Her body screamed for her to run, to fight, to do something. But she didn't. Because black women don't get that luxury. We get composure, or we get buried. Maya stared back at him, stone still, her breath shallow, her hands raised. She had led missions across oceans. spoken in classified rooms about nuclear strategy. But here she was, paralyzed by one man's hatred. And still she didn't flinch. Then, sirens again. But this time they weren't for her. They were for him. Multiple squad cars screeched onto the shoulder. Officers poured out. One of them, a black lieutenant with command in every muscle, stepped forward, hand raised. "Cooper, lower your weapon!" he shouted. Bradley didn't move at first. He looked torn between rage and disbelief, as if this outcome, the exposure, the shame, wasn't how it was supposed to end. But finally, slowly, he lowered the gun. The moment the lieutenant learned Maya's full title, everything shifted. A stunned silence swept over the scene. Todd's jaw clenched. Bradley's face turned red. "You're done," the lieutenant said. "Cuff him." Even then, Bradley resisted. "You think this is over? You think this means anything?" he hissed. Maya didn't blink. "I know exactly what this means." But when they took him away, when the gun was no longer pointed at her, she didn't feel victorious. She felt broken. Because this wasn't justice. Not really. Justice would be not being pulled over at all. Justice would be being seen as human first. Justice would be her not having to press record to stay alive. A man from the roadside stepped into view, phone still in hand. "I got the whole thing," he said softly. "They do this all the time. Just not to someone like you." His words hit harder than the gun ever could. Because he was right. Maya had power. She had backup. But what about the others? What about the girl in the borrowed car? What about the mom just trying to get home from work? What about the college student without federal clearance or DC on speed dial? Maya cried that night, not in front of them, but alone in her SUV. She cried not for herself, but for everyone who didn't get sirens, who didn't get justice, who didn't get to go home. She felt the weight of her ancestors pressing against her chest. She felt the rage of the unheard, the grief of the unseen. And somewhere deep inside that pain, something else stirred. Resolve. Because this story wasn't just hers, it was ours, and it needed to be told. Maya Thompson stood up. Not just for herself, but for everyone who's been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. She used her voice, her calm, her control, to survive and to demand change. But change doesn't happen alone. If you believe in standing up to injustice, if you felt the weight of Maya's pain, if you saw even a piece of yourself or someone you love in her story, like this video. Subscribe to our channel. Let Maya know she's not alone. Let the world know we're watching. Because justice doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we all speak together. Let me know if you'd like this adapted into a video script with voiceover timing, visuals, or background music cues for maximum emotional impact. There are moments in life when silence can kill you. And Maya Thompson knew she was standing on the edge of one. The night air was thick, not just with Florida heat, but with the weight of something unspeakable pressing on her chest. Her black SUV sat alone under the indifferent stars on a dark, empty stretch of Highway 17, flanked by red and blue lights that spun like warnings from another world. In the rearview mirror, the flashing strobes turned her face into a mask, stoic, unreadable. But inside, her heart thundered like a war drum. She wasn't just driving home that night. She was fleeing something. Not from fear, but from what she had done. Something impossible. Something no one in her position was supposed to do. Not a high-ranking intelligence officer. Not a black woman who'd survived the system only to challenge it. But she had done it anyway. And if the men behind her cruiser knew even half of it, They wouldn't just pull her over. They'd bury her. It had started like a normal evening, if there were ever such a thing in Maya's line of work. She'd left a secure federal facility hours earlier, the weight of a top-secret operation still ringing in her ears. But somewhere between the sterile conference room and the highway's quiet desolation, she had made a decision, one that could destroy her career, unravel decades of sacrifice, and make her the target of not just the law, but something far worse. She had taken something. Not a file, not a weapon. Something far more dangerous. And now, every second ticked with the tension of what she carried, both in her car and in her soul. That's when the sirens appeared behind her, and that's when she knew. Someone knew. The patrol car didn't pass. It hovered, followed. Then the lights came on, sudden and blinding. She exhaled slowly, her fingers gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in her world. Maya didn't panic. She couldn't afford to. Panic was a luxury black women in her position didn't get. She reached for her phone and tapped the recording app. One light blinked red. Then she hit a second number, a line meant for emergencies that couldn't be explained in a report. "Director Thompson," came the voice. "I'm being pulled over. Highway 17. No reason given. 15 miles outside Jacksonville. Units are en route. Do not engage." She ended the call. The recording continued, but it wouldn't protect her. Not tonight. Not if they found out what was really happening. A door slammed behind her. Heavy boots crunched gravel. Maya didn't look. Not yet. She had to breathe. She had to rehearse the face that had gotten her through congressional hearings, war room briefings, and diplomatic standoffs. But when she rolled down the window, when she finally turned to meet the eyes of the officer approaching, she knew immediately. This wasn't a routine stop. This was a hunt. Officer Bradley Cooper looked at her like she was prey, smirking, confident, dangerous. His flashlight flicked across her face with unnecessary force. "Lot of road out here," he said. "Not a lot of reason to be driving this late. Where you headed, sweetheart?" She didn't answer the question. Instead, she asked, "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" Her voice was calm, deliberate, but inside she was calculating. Did he know? Had someone tipped them off? Or was this just another man in uniform seeing a black woman in a luxury SUV and deciding to remind her who he thought the world belonged to? His smirk deepened. "License and registration. And don't try anything cute." She moved slowly, carefully. She didn't dare open the wrong compartment. Her fingers found the documents, but not before she slid a second phone, smaller, encrypted, beneath the passenger seat with a flick of her wrist. A single file was inside that phone. A file that wasn't supposed to exist. Bradley snatched her ID. His lips curled when he read her name. "Maya Thompson. I've heard of you." That chilled her more than the night air. Had he? How? "One of those DC types. Always think you know better. Always got something to prove. Always running your mouth until it's too late." He glanced over his shoulder. His partner, Officer Todd Jefferson, leaned against their cruiser, arms crossed, watching. Silent. Dangerous in a different way. The kind who didn't start trouble but finished it. The kind who would say, "I didn't see anything," in a report filed a week too late. Bradley leaned in. "So tell me, Miss Thompson, what exactly are you trying to prove tonight?" The words were bait, but Maya didn't bite. Not with what she was carrying. Not with the risks already hanging over her. "Am I being detained, officer?" she asked instead. That was when the switch flipped. The smirk disappeared. The tone hardened. "Step out of the car," he barked. On what grounds? Suspicious behavior. Behind him, Todd chuckled. They always get real suspicious when they're hiding something. Maya's pulse spiked. Did they know? Were they bluffing? She had faced hostile foreign agents, assassins, and cyber hackers who'd tried to dismantle national security systems. But this was different. Because here, the law was the weapon. The suspicion was the excuse, and her identity was the threat. She didn't move. The door stayed locked. That made him furious. He slammed his hand against the roof. Open the door, he shouted. Not without legal cause, Maya replied. And then he pulled his gun. The flashlight dropped. The weapon rose. She was staring down the barrel before her next breath. Get out of the car. Now. His voice was lower, stripped of performance. This was raw, unfiltered hatred, the kind she'd read about in case files, the kind she'd warned others about, the kind she knew could pull a trigger and sleep at night. But Maya didn't flinch, because if she was going to die tonight, she was going to die standing. Then, sirens. More. Closer. Multiple squad cars swerving onto the shoulder, engines rumbling, tires screeching, and finally, men shouting. A black lieutenant stepped forward, hand up, voice sharp. Cooper! Lower your weapon! Bradley froze. Just for a second. Then, reluctantly, slowly, he complied. Maya stayed still. Not because she was safe now, but because safety was never real. Not for people like her. The lieutenant approached. Ma'am, are you... Director Maya Thompson, National Intelligence. The words echoed through the stunned silence. Bradley's face went pale. Todd stiffened. You're done, the lieutenant said. Cuff him. They resisted. Not physically, but emotionally. You could see it. In their eyes. In their silence. The way Bradley sneered. You think this means anything? As the cuffs clicked around his wrists. But Maya didn't respond to him. She looked at the lieutenant instead. I want everything documented. Their records. Every complaint. Every report buried. I want it all out. He nodded. Understood. But it wasn't over. Not for her. Because somewhere, in a place cameras couldn't see, she had hidden that encrypted phone. The file. The secret she couldn't speak aloud. A secret that, if exposed, could take down names etched into Washington's highest walls. The corruption wasn't just in two racist cops on a highway. It was embedded in the system that trained them, empowered them, protected them. And Maya had stolen the proof. The question wasn't what they would do next. It was what she would. Maya Thompson didn't just survive that night. She held a secret that could expose a truth no one was ready for. But the risks she took were unthinkable. The pressure crushing. And the cost? It might still be coming. Like this video if you believe in courage under fire. Comment below. To let Maya know, you are not alone. We see you. We support you. Subscribe to join a movement that refuses to stay silent. Because some stories don't just need to be heard. They demand to be witnessed. Let me know if you want to adapt this into a voiceover script, visual breakdown, or interactive video episode with cliffhangers. From the outside, it just looked like a traffic stop. A pair of flashing red and blue lights on a quiet stretch of Florida highway. A black SUV pulled off to the shoulder. Two officers stepping out into the night. Routine. Mundane. But inside that SUV, Maya Thompson was silently preparing for war. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She was reaching for the strength she had trained her entire life to hold in moments like this. the strength to survive when the world decides you don't deserve to. Because Maya wasn't just tired from a long day. She wasn't just another driver on the road. She was carrying something few people knew about, and even fewer could handle. A secret that could destroy careers, topple political empires, and expose decades of buried injustice. She had already risked everything by taking it. Now, stopped on the side of the road by two white officers with superiority in their smiles and silence in their eyes, she had to decide whether to give in to fear or fight to be believed. The air was heavy with that suffocating tension only black people seem to recognize before it explodes. The older officer, Bradley Cooper, was built like a man who never expected to be questioned. His gut spilled over his belt, but he moved with the casual threat of someone who believed the badge on his chest was a license to control. His partner, Todd Jefferson, was younger, quieter. His arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against the cruiser, like this was all a show he'd seen before. But Maya wasn't performing. She was surviving. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, already recording. Her hands gripped the steering wheel in plain view. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, level, but beneath it lived a storm of pain, rage, and resolve that had been building for years. "Is there a reason I was pulled over?" she asked. Bradley ignored the question. "License and registration," he said instead. His tone was flat, practiced, but his eyes lingered too long. She handed him the documents with deliberate precision. No sudden moves. She had rehearsed this before, not in a classroom, but in life. Like every black parent who teaches their child how to survive being pulled over, Maya had learned early that compliance wasn't about guilt. It was about survival. Then he saw her name. "Maya Thompson," he muttered. He looked at her again, longer this time. "I've heard of you." Her breath caught for half a second. "I bet you think you're real important," he added. "All them suits in D.C., right? Fancy title, big words. But out here, you're just another one of them." Them. The word hit like a slap. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," he said. And then, without warning, he ordered her out of the car. "On what grounds?" she asked. He grinned. "Suspicious behavior." Behind him, Todd let out a soft chuckle. "Always suspicious once the lights come on, huh?" Maya's heart pounded in her ears, not from guilt, but from history. She had read too many names, seen too many autopsy reports, studied too many dashcam videos where someone who looked like her didn't make it home. But she wasn't just carrying fear, she was carrying evidence. In the small, encrypted drive hidden inside the lining of her purse was a file she had extracted from a classified server. A file that revealed a covert operation involving high-ranking law enforcement officials, forged warrants, and unlawful surveillance of black activists. The kind of file that people disappeared over. She hadn't told anyone. Not yet. She needed proof. She needed safety. And now she needed to get out alive. She kept her hands on the wheel. "I will not exit the vehicle without cause," she said firmly. Bradley's eyes darkened, and then he drew his weapon. The barrel aimed straight at her head through the driver's window. In that frozen moment, Maya wasn't a director, a strategist, a public servant. She was a target. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. "You think you can talk circles around me and walk away? Not tonight, sweetheart." Her throat tightened, but she didn't move. Because movement could be twisted into resistance, resistance into threat, and threat into a bullet. She had seen it too many times. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Should she reach for her badge? Would that escalate him more? Could she distract him? Talk him down? Every second the gun remained pointed at her. The odds of survival dropped. She couldn't outrun a bullet. But maybe, just maybe, she could outlast his arrogance. And then came the sound that changed everything. Sirens. More. Louder. Closer. Bradley's eyes twitched. He didn't lower the gun right away. But his power, the illusion of it, cracked. 2 more cruisers screamed onto the shoulder. Officers spilled out. One of them, a black lieutenant with eyes that had seen too much and tolerated too little, stormed forward. "Cooper, lower your weapon! Now!" For a moment, the scene held its breath. Then slowly, Bradley complied. Maya didn't move. Because trauma doesn't end when the threat leaves. It lingers. It settles. It rewrites you. The lieutenant approached. "Ma'am, are you—" "Maya Thompson, Director of Strategic Intelligence." Silence. Bradley's jaw clenched. Todd looked like a man who had just realized he bet on the wrong side. "You're done," the lieutenant said. "Cuff him." As they hauled Bradley and Todd away, Maya stayed frozen. Not because she was afraid now, but because she still couldn't believe how close she had come to dying for the truth. And then the real heartbreak hit her. What if she hadn't been who she was? What if she hadn't had the title, the connections, the backup? Would she be a headline, a hashtag, a name carved on a mural next to others? It wasn't over. The file in her purse was still there, burning, alive. The truth hadn't been told, but now it would be, because Maya wasn't going to stay silent, not anymore. A man approached from the roadside. His phone had been recording the whole time. "You good?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Thanks to you." He hesitated. "They do this all the time," he said. "Just not to someone like you." And that's when she broke. Not into tears, not into screams, but into something deeper, a moment of clarity, a realization that she had a platform others didn't, a voice others weren't allowed to use. And now, a responsibility. Maya Thompson didn't just survive that night. She endured it. She carried a secret. She stood her ground. And in doing so, she uncovered something much larger than herself. The truth about a system built to silence people like her. But she didn't stay silent. And neither should we. Like this story if you believe in Maya's courage. Comment below with words of encouragement for her. Let her know we see her. Subscribe for more true stories that shine a light where darkness wants to hide. Because the truth doesn't live in silence. It lives in all of us willing to stand, even when standing almost gets you killed. Let me know if you'd like this adapted into a YouTube video voiceover with visual cues, sound design, or broken into a serialized format for episodic release. The first thing Kendall Bennett noticed was the silence. Not the gentle hush of a luxury jet soaring above the clouds, but the sharp, watching kind of silence, the kind that clung to every breath, every glance, every subtle shift in posture around her. She could feel it tightening like a noose the moment she stepped into the first-class cabin. Her heels clicked softly on the aisle carpet. Her coat was pressed, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. But none of that mattered. Not to the woman in the navy blue uniform who stood frozen by the service galley, watching Kendall like she'd wandered into the wrong world. And maybe, to the flight attendant, she had. After all, what was a young black woman doing in seat 1A, dressed in elegance, wearing silence like armor, eyes sharper than most passengers had ever seen? Kendall didn't offer a smile. She didn't need to. Not today. Today, she was here for a reason. She placed her carry-on gently in the overhead compartment, took her seat by the window, and crossed her legs like she owned the sky. She didn't need to pretend, because she did own it. Not in a literal sense, but in the way people do when they walk into a space meant to exclude them and refuse to shrink. She had been underestimated her entire life, laughed at in boardrooms, talked over in conference calls, ignored in lounges she paid more than enough to belong in. But this wasn't about proving anything. It was about setting something in motion. The flight attendant moved stiffly down the aisle, glancing at the manifest in her hand. Then back at Kendall. Her name tag read Madison. Blonde bun, tight smile, the kind of woman who'd compliment a white passenger's baby while ignoring the black woman across the aisle, struggling with her coat. Madison paused, then backtracked to Kendall's seat. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, voice coated in artificial sugar. "I believe there may have been a mix-up. This is first class." Kendall turned to her slowly. "Is that right?" Madison hesitated. "May I see your boarding pass?" Kendall didn't blink. She reached into her leather clutch and handed it over with practiced grace. Madison took it, scanned the name, Kendall R. Bennett, and something behind her eyes shifted. Not surprise. Something more fragile. Recognition. She handed it back, her mouth twitching. "Very well," she said curtly. "Let us know if you need anything." Kendall nodded once. That would be the end of it, or at least it should have been. But Madison lingered, her fingers clenching slightly against her tray. She walked away, but her posture didn't relax. Neither did Kendall's. Because this wasn't just a misunderstanding. And Kendall hadn't simply come here to fly. She had planned for this. Every second, every movement, every word. She was waiting to see if the rest would unfold as expected. It didn't take long. 10 minutes into the flight, while others sipped champagne and adjusted silk sleep masks, Madison returned. "Ma'am," she said again, now louder, "can I speak with you privately?" Eyes turned. Not many. Just enough to matter. Kendall raised a brow. "We can speak right here." Madison leaned in, fake smile back on. "We received a call from the gate. There's a security concern." "A security concern?" Kendall repeated, voice low. "With me?" "I'm just following protocol." Kendall said nothing for a beat. Then calmly, she unbuckled her seatbelt. "Then follow it." She stood. Madison guided her toward the galley. There, out of sight from the other passengers, Madison's tone dropped all pretense. "We've had complaints," she said, "that you may have used fraudulent credentials to board. You don't seem to be on the upgrade list. You weren't on the original manifest." Kendall tilted her head. "And you assumed what, exactly?" "That you weren't supposed to be here," Madison said tightly. "We take security very seriously, Ms. Bennett." Kendall smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "So do I." And that's when Madison made the mistake. "I know your type," she hissed. "The influencers, the ones who think a designer bag and an attitude are enough to lie your way into a seat you can't afford." Kendall's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes hardened. She leaned in and whispered, "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Madison blinked, and in that moment, the mask slipped. Because this wasn't a mix-up. This wasn't even about race alone. This was personal. Madison knew the name. She'd seen it somewhere. She just hadn't connected it to the woman in front of her. Not yet. But she would. Kendall returned to her seat, still poised, still calm. The other passengers avoided her gaze. Madison didn't speak to her again for the rest of the flight, but the damage was done. And that's exactly what Kendall had hoped for. When the plane landed, airport security was waiting. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the jet bridge. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Madison stood tall, expectant, lips twitching with smugness. "She's the one," she said, pointing to Kendall. "Seat 1A. But the officers didn't move toward Kendall. Instead, they looked at Madison. "You're Madison Brooks?" She blinked. "Yes, but please come with us." "What?" she sputtered. "No, she's the one! She's the one who shouldn't have been here. I called it in." The lead officer held up a document. "You've been named in a formal complaint of racial profiling, discrimination, and abuse of authority during flight. You're being placed on administrative suspension pending investigation." The color drained from Madison's face. "Wait. What?" Kendall stood slowly, her expression still unreadable. "You shouldn't have remembered my name," she said softly. "You should have remembered what you did." Madison's mouth opened, but no words came out. And then Kendall walked past her. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Madison was led away. Only then did someone speak. It was a middle-aged man in business class. "What just happened?" Another woman answered. "That woman in 1A, she wasn't just a passenger." And she was right. Because Kendall Bennett wasn't just anyone. She was the niece of the CEO of the airline, a civil rights attorney, a corporate ethics consultant. And most importantly, she had been planning this flight for 3 months. Madison Brooks had been named in 4 previous complaints, all quietly buried, all ignored. Until now, because Kendall had made sure this one would be different. Everything, from the seat booking to the flight route, to the internal cameras placed in strategic corners of the first-class cabin, had been arranged. She hadn't come here to travel. She had come to test the system that protected people like Madison. And she'd done it perfectly. By the end of the week, Madison's name was trending, not in the way she had wanted. A video clip, quietly filmed by another passenger, had gone viral. Hashtag after hashtag poured in. Seat 1A, Kendall Bennett. Flying while black. Believe black women. But Kendall never commented publicly. She didn't need to. The story spoke for itself. Because in the end, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about walking into spaces not built for you, and making them reckon with your presence. What would you have done in Kendall's place? Would you have stayed calm? Would you have walked away? Or would you have done what she did? Silently, strategically, and with devastating precision? If you believe in justice, in calling out bias, in the power of silent strength. Like this story. Comment below to show Kendall your support. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the system and celebrate courage. Because some heroes don't wear capes. They wear first-class tickets, and they change the world without raising their voice. Elijah Rivers sat quietly in the back row of room 214, his hands folded neatly on his desk, his shoulders drawn tight beneath the weight of something no one else could see. He was just 11, barely tall enough to reach the top shelf of the classroom bookshelf, but he carried a silence far older than his years. A silence made of missed opportunities, low expectations, and quiet looks exchanged when teachers thought he wasn't watching. He noticed everything, especially her, Miss Thornton, his 6th grade teacher, with the tidy ponytail, the clipboard always tucked beneath her arm, and the smile that stopped just short of reaching her eyes when she looked at him. From the very first week of school, Elijah had known what she thought of him. She didn't have to say it out loud. It was in her tone when she called on him, sharp, dismissive, always expecting wrong answers. It was in the way she heaped praise on the students with fairer skin and louder voices, the ones who interrupted freely and turned every comment into a performance. Elijah wasn't loud. He wasn't boastful. He was careful. Every answer he offered was weighed, measured, thoughtful. But that wasn't what Miss Thornton wanted. She wanted speed, confidence, familiarity, and most of all, she wanted to be right about him. So she overlooked his raised hand, graded his essays with clipped comments, called on him only when she knew the question was hard enough to stump him, and when she returned his quiz with a red 82 scrawled across the top, she didn't praise him for the progress. She just said, "Not bad, Elijah. Better luck next time." And yet, Elijah never stopped trying, not because he needed her approval, but because he had made a promise to his mom, who worked 2 jobs and still managed to sit beside him each night as he read his history book aloud, to his grandma, who filled the house with the sound of old gospel hymns and always reminded him, "Baby, your mind is a gift. Don't let the world convince you otherwise." And to himself, to the version of him he could become if he just kept going. But some days, it was almost too much. Like the day Miss Thornton introduced the winter recital. Each student would participate in a class performance, songs, poems, skits, even musical instruments. The room buzzed with excitement. Elijah kept his head down, already knowing what was coming. "Elijah," Miss Thornton said, scanning the list, "what will you be doing?" He looked up slowly. "I play piano," he said softly. A pause. Her eyes narrowed. "Piano?" "Yes, ma'am." "Really?" Her tone made it a statement, not a question. "Well, that's unexpected." The word tasted like doubt. Elijah nodded, the back of his throat tightening. "I've been playing since I was 6. "We'll see," she replied curtly. "Make sure you practice. This is a formal performance." He practiced, every night, not because of her, because of his father. Elijah's dad had taught him to play on an old upright piano they'd rescued from a neighbor's curb. The keys were chipped, the sound a little out of tune, but Elijah had loved it anyway. His father had passed the following year, but the piano stayed. And so did the music. Each night before the recital, Elijah sat on the worn bench, his small fingers dancing across the ivory like he was writing something sacred. He didn't just play notes. He told stories through chords, poured his heart into crescendos, and stitched his grief into every pause. But the day of the recital, the doubts came rushing back. He wore a clean button-down shirt, shoes his mom had polished the night before, and a small cross necklace that had once belonged to his father. As he waited for his turn, he watched Miss Thornton beam with pride as her favorite students performed. She clapped the loudest for Emma's violin solo, smiled brightly at Daniel's comedy sketch, and then it was Elijah's turn. The auditorium fell quiet as he stepped up to the stage, the soft thud of his shoes against the wooden floor echoing louder than expected. He sat down at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his fingers gently on the keys. He didn't look at Miss Thornton. He didn't need to, because what came next would speak louder than she ever had. He began to play. At first it was soft, delicate, a lullaby in a storm. Then the melody swelled, rising with every heartbeat, telling a story of pain, love, memory, and resilience. It wasn't just music. It was him. Every note was a piece of the boy who had been overlooked. Every chord was a memory of the man he wanted to become. The room, once filled with chatter, now sat frozen, captive to the sound of a child who had been invisible 5 minutes earlier. And Miss Thornton? She didn't move. Her clipboard dropped to her lap. Her mouth parted slightly. She had no idea. When Elijah finished, he lifted his hands from the keys and let the silence linger, powerful and whole. And then the room erupted. Not in polite claps, but in thunderous applause. His classmates rose to their feet. Parents gasped. Even the principal wiped away a tear. Elijah didn't look for Miss Thornton's reaction. He didn't need her approval anymore. Because for the first time, he had been seen. After the performance, she approached him. Her voice was different now, hushed, almost shaky. "Elijah, I didn't know you could do that." He looked up at her, eyes steady. "You never asked." And with that, he walked away. Elijah Rivers is more than a quiet student in the back of the room. He's a reminder that greatness often whispers before it roars. His story is one of dignity, quiet resistance, and the power of proving yourself. Not with anger, not with noise, but with truth, beauty, and raw, undeniable talent. If you believe in Elijah's journey, if you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or doubted, like this video, comment below to let Elijah know his music was heard, his voice matters, and he is not invisible. Subscribe for more true stories of perseverance, quiet strength, and extraordinary young people who break barriers in the most beautiful ways. Because sometimes the most powerful voices don't speak. They play. When the dust finally settled, Vanessa Thompson stood on the steps of the Arlington Police Department, not just as the city's first black police chief, but as a symbol of what was possible when courage met conviction. Just days ago, she had walked through those very same doors undercover, dressed in plain clothes, unrecognized by the officers who sneered at her, shoved her, and dismissed her like she didn't belong. Lieutenant Richard Miller, tall and proud in his uniform, had been the first to shove her against the wall, his voice dripping with mock authority as he asked, "What are you doing in here, lady?" The others had watched, some laughing, some silent, but none intervening. They didn't know who she was, and that's what made their truth spill out so easily. Their bias, their entitlement, their contempt. They saw only what they wanted to see. A black woman in a place they didn't think she deserved to be. But Vanessa had said nothing. Not at first. She'd simply looked around at the toxic culture festering behind those walls, collected names, faces, and attitudes, and let the moment steep. And then, when the time was right, she'd returned, not in silence, but in full uniform. With a press conference behind her and the mayor at her side, her badge gleaming on her chest, she looked those same men in the eye and said, "You didn't see me for who I was because you never learned how to look beyond your own fear." The clip went viral. Millions watched as the expressions of arrogance melted into horror. It was a reckoning, a long overdue confrontation between appearance and reality, prejudice and power. One by one, those who had laughed that day were placed on leave, investigated, and replaced. The walls began to shake, and this time they didn't rebuild them with the same rotten bricks. But Vanessa didn't celebrate with champagne or headlines. She celebrated with action. She didn't just want to be the first. She wanted to make sure she wasn't the last. She started by hiring community officers from the neighborhoods most ignored. She held listening sessions in school gyms and church basements. She made the station doors open wider, not just physically, but emotionally. There were new training programs, new leadership pipelines, new complaint procedures that didn't disappear into silence. The blue wall of silence? She broke it down, brick by brick. And yet it wasn't just policy that made Vanessa a force. It was how she carried the weight of what she had endured, with grace, strength, and a refusal to be bitter. She never once raised her voice in retaliation. She didn't shame people for being afraid of change. She showed them what change looked like and dared them to follow. There was a moment, weeks after the transition, when she stood alone in her office, the sun casting a golden light across her desk. On the wall behind her was a framed quote she'd written out herself. "Power is not control. It is the ability to lift others even when you're still healing." Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers along the polished wood of the desk. It had once belonged to Chief Rowland, a man who had retired quietly just before she stepped in. He had never supported her candidacy, never spoken out against it either. But silence, she'd learned, was often the loudest weapon. As she sat in his old chair, she remembered every step it took to get there. The years of service, the examinations, the late-night calls she took while cradling her sleeping daughter, the tears she cried in her car after losing colleagues to gunfire and racism alike. The family members who told her she was crazy to want to change a system that hated her. The friends who stopped calling when she joined the force. The mirror she faced every morning, questioning if she was becoming what she once feared. And yet, she had never lost herself. Because even when they underestimated her, she had never stopped over-preparing. Even when they tried to shut her out, she found a way in. Even when they told her she was too much, too black, too female, too principled, too outspoken, she became exactly what they feared. A leader, a reformer, a mirror they couldn't ignore. And maybe that's the lesson we take from Vanessa's story. That dignity isn't about staying silent, it's about knowing when to speak. That strength isn't about revenge, it's about rebuilding. That healing a broken system doesn't start with permission. It starts with one person who's brave enough to call it broken in the first place. You might not be a police chief. You might not wear a badge or stand behind a podium. But in your own life, there will be moments where you're misunderstood, underestimated, pushed to the side, or told your voice doesn't matter. And in those moments, remember Vanessa. Remember the woman who stood up, not for the cameras, not for the applause, but for the little girl she used to be. The one who looked around her neighborhood and wondered if things could ever get better. She became the answer to that question. And so can you. If Vanessa's story moved you, if you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or silenced because of who you are, this is your moment to speak him. Comment below with words of encouragement for Vanessa and others like her. Tell us how you've turned doubt into determination. Tell us what you're fighting for. Your voice matters, and we're listening. Like this video to show your support for strong women like Vanessa, who rise above the noise and lead with integrity. Subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that empower, uplift, and ignite change. Because we don't just tell stories here, we create community. And Vanessa Thompson's story is just the beginning.